There's perhaps no more significant topic being discussed today than the issue of de-dollarization. And just for a quick background explainer, the idea is that the US dollar is dominant throughout the world in both global trade and global finance, and that the days of this hegemony, this power that the US dollar holds, is on the decline. Not to sound too Chinese, if you will, but that is both an accurate and inaccurate assessment. People I have found have yet to sort of understand that the dollar system, the US dollar system, has two parts to it. There is the part that is the US dollar as what's called the medium of exchange, meaning we're going to trade with each other, and rather than someone in Brazil trading with somebody in Thailand using their currencies, they'll just use the dollar. It's much easier. The dollar's used everywhere. So a lot of trade is used through the US dollar. But there's another, I would argue, even more important role that the dollar plays, and that is as a reserve asset. Now, what is a reserve asset? Well, that means every country, when they trade with another country, at the end of a given period, one country probably is traded more than with the other country. So they have more dollars, if you will, at the end of that period than the other country. So the question is, it's like a bank account for a country. Like if you have all this extra dollars at the end of the year, as an example, what do you do with it? Well, historically, what countries have done is they've invested those excess dollars into the American government bond market. So they'll buy American bonds. And it's been used as sort of a very safe place to be able to put your excess reserves. It's that fact in that area that has become much more at risk, if you will, to the dollar system, to de-dollarizing. There is an ongoing concern amongst many countries now that the United States has demonstrated a willingness, if you will, to weaponize the US dollar. And what I mean by weaponize is that countries that have shown not to go along with what the United States wants them to do, or countries that have taken action that the Americans have decided is very bad action, the government, America has said, you can no longer operate in the US dollar system. The most recent example of this, and an obvious example, quite frankly, was Russia, when Russia decided to invade Ukraine. Now, we don't have to go into the debate of whether the actions of Russia were right or the actions by America essentially stealing the Russians' money, their US dollars, was right. But it was more the message. And the message that the American policy of weaponizing the dollar showed was, if you don't necessarily follow or do something that is against the American policy, you too might be at risk. And this is something that not just China, but many other countries have noticed, and quite frankly have decided that they want to find ways to not necessarily move completely away from the dollar, but they want to de-risk. They want to find other alternatives. And this is where the renminbi has begun to play somewhat of a role, again, but only through the medium of exchange. So there is the idea of the global south. In the global south, there are a bunch of developing countries in South America, in Southeast Asia, and throughout the world. And more countries are considering and even are using the renminbi to trade with one another. And that's great. But you also have the reserve asset. What you also find is these countries are not taking their renminbi and saying, oh, we want to use that and we're going to buy Chinese government bonds, much like the US government bond. What they're doing is they're actually using that renminbi and they're buying gold. And they're using that gold as the reserve asset. So the concept of de-dollarization is certainly real, but it's not a black and white issue. It's moving in a certain direction. I think it's very important that the Americans understand that when they make policy shifts, these policy shifts will have other repercussions that they may or may not have thought through clearly, and that's fine. But I think it's important to learn from certain mistakes. But it goes beyond de-dollarization because this is really about trade. And I find it fascinating that the idea of de-risking, not just from the dollar system, but de-risking from trade in general, is also ongoing. And the best way to describe this is there is a new rail, very important rail system that runs between Xi'an in China all the way to Tehran in Iran. And it's kind of part of the new Silk Road. And this rail system going back and forth is specifically for trade with the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and goes outside of the traditional shipping trade system that would have to go to Shanghai and then go all the way down through the South China Sea and then up, which is always a risk for non-allied American nations, because America kind of rules the seven seas, as it were, through its naval power. So de-risking is not just a de-dollarization, it's happening across a number of different elements. And my outlook is this is going to continue, as we like to say, at the margins, meaning just a little bit here and a little bit there. But over time, this will, I believe, have an impact. And it is, quite frankly, providing China with the opportunity to be able to extend its reach geopolitically.